In 2021, I've worked on the German television series Legal Affairs as the VFX Supervisor, and I also actually made all of the visual effects shots. There was a wide range of types of effects and techniques necessary, so hopefully this will be interesting. Let's start with the first visual effects shot of the series, and also the first one that I worked on. The idea here was to have a drone shot of a bus that vanishes behind trees and crashes shortly after, with the audience only seeing the pillar of smoke and some flames. My first instinct was to use a pre-rendered explosion, but every asset I tried out wasn't working due to various reasons. Director Randa Shahood also had a very exact image in her mind when we would see flames and when they would vanish. That's why I ultimately decided to simulate the explosion. First, I tracked the drone shot in SynthEyes. Then I filled up the trees to remove the visible lights of the bus and some other cars that were shining through the trees. Next, I recolored the sky, added some stars and made further color changes to match the shot to the nighttime in which it is supposed to play. This was all done in Fusion using SynthEyes' Camera Matchmove. Then I made a basic bus model and simulated the explosion in Houdini. This was my first ever client shot rendered in Houdini's Karma rendering engine, just because I wanted to try it out and it was new at the time. It's now become my main render engine. Another big sequence was a drone chase, which featured a fully CG drone attacking the two main characters. We talked to a drone operator if it would be feasible to use a real drone. After all, this is based on a true story. I know it sounds crazy, but it was clear that the drones that we could safely fly around people would not be intimidating enough or couldn't even fly in the tunnel. Even without a real drone, it was quite a hectic day on set. But before we shot the drone chase, I had some time to take photos, videos and measurements of the tunnel. And this was crucial here to achieve anything at all. For the tunnel entrance, I simply placed some black tape on the pillars, as there wasn't a lot of detail otherwise to track the camera with. Of course, they had to be removed again when I worked on the sequence. The first few shots were more or less straightforward. There was some complexity because some shots were retimed, and of course we added a few seconds and removed them here and there when we refined the animation, but overall it was a lot of fun to animate the drone. I worked closely with director Randa Shahood to create the threatening drone movements without looking too sci-fi or unrealistic, but keeping the desired pacing in mind. The shots inside the tunnel were more complex. The camera matchmove alone took me quite some time, as it was shot handheld with a shallow focus and in difficult lighting conditions. Thankfully it worked out, mostly because I had survey shots done which SynthEyes could use to map out the points, even with very little parallax or difficult movements in the actually used material. The whole drone sequence was rendered in Mantra. I wanted to try Karma for this too, but quickly gave up simply because with Mantra you always know what you get and I feel quite at home with it. Something like getting a pass for only the shadows inside a reflection is something that I knew I could do in Mantra but not anywhere else. The render times were actually not that bad either, even though it's a CPU only render engine, as you can optimize Mantra quite well. I also always rendered the drone blades separately as they required a high amount of substeps for good motion blur, but almost no diffuse bounces. But since we have quite a lot of different lighting conditions, especially later in the tunnel, I didn't want to use just a plain texture for the blades, and I'm glad I didn't. I used Mocha a little bit to speed up roto, but also utilized Fusion's planar tracker for this. And the same as with everything else you're seeing, it was composited in Fusion. Another fun sequence was the blood on the two actors in the airport. I used Mocha to track the face and scarf and animated several blood textures on top. Mocha's power mesh was okay, but I still had to use a grid warp in Fusion to manually animate it and get the blood to truly stick on the skin and the scarf on the first shot. It's subtle, but it does a tremendous amount to underline the urgency and panic in the scene. I get asked a lot why something like this is done in visual effects and not with fake blood on set. And the answer is, it depends. Fake blood is used a lot, and if you can, use it. But especially if you have little time available, you might only have one take in which everything has to work, or you go into overtime cleaning it up from set, the actors, and hopefully you have a wardrobe change ready. Simply put, the time to reset can be more expensive than paying a visual effects artist. Here it was discussed to use fake blood, but ultimately after talking to me it was decided that I would add the blood later and they rather shoot several takes. Other visual effects included things like adding a red light into the warped reflection of a supposed to be studio. And of course all kinds of removers as in every show or movie, like a boom mic, a banner, or the camera and equipment from the reflection in these sunglasses. I also did a lot of cleanup to artifacts caused by the usage of optical flow retiming, but that's not that interesting to look at. And last but not least, because this is what I spent most of my time with, screen inserts. We had a high amount of displays that had to be added or replaced, some of them straightforward, but some worlds are quite challenging as they were more or less done completely by hand. For example, this shot which had this refresh rate issue, so we had flickering rolling bars on the phone screen, which threw every tracker off. There are also no real corners, complicating it even further. Together with the shallow focus and the hand covering the display at times, it was impossible for any point, planar or 3D geo-tracker to find anything usable. Since you need to be able to read at least parts of the headline, I also had to keep the insert in focus longer than the actual shot was sharp on the screen, making it even harder to integrate into the scene. I ended up keeping the edges blurred as realistic as possible and reducing the blur just on the texts. It was quite the process, and usually shots like these aren't talked about in these kinds of videos. They're not fancy or flashy and on top problematic, but that's just stuff that can happen in productions, especially if you can't be on set the whole time. The shot is important for the story and I'm glad it worked out eventually. Other inserts like this one were actually tracked in 3D with SynthEyes, and then refined in Fusion as even Mocha was sometimes struggling to track something that blurry, that's half of the screen. But I had enough points for a 3D match move sometimes. I often had to use different approaches per shot to minimize doing something completely by hand. I did over 120 shots for the whole season, but I'm very happy both the directors Randa Shahut and Stefan Bühling, as well as the production company UFA, gave me their trust to do this and even allowed us to do things that I had never done before at that point, like the drone chase. It was a challenge, but a fun one. If you have any more questions, feel free to ask them, otherwise that's all. As of the time of recording, you can watch Legal Affairs in Germany and Switzerland on Netflix, and even for free on the ARD Mediathek, which I assume only works in Germany. Thank you for watching and see ya.
Den Karren an die Wand. Der Thron verbrannt, du willst den Glanz zurück.